So I'm Steve Cinderby. I'm a senior researcher in the Stockholm Environment Institute Centre at the University of York. So my current project in Africa is sponsored by the High Volume Transport Programme. And what we're doing in this is actually trying to build impact from some of the previous research that we've done. So rather than collecting new data and doing new engagement, what we're doing now is sharing back a lot of the findings, particularly about the methods and approaches that we found successful with planners and decision makers across the whole of Africa. So in collaboration with UNEP, we're holding workshops in 5 different locations across the continent, bringing city planners and decision makers interested in road safety issues together to learn about some of the approaches that we've used that we found successful, including participatory GIS, and then also running online masterclasses with them to teach them some of these approaches. So in this case, it's not about new research, collecting new data, it's about actually the impact and generating impact from those approaches so that this becomes much more embedded in African processes. Participatory GIS is a participatory engagement method. So the approach is designed to try and collectively identify local communities or particular stakeholders who know about a place and a topic, to collectively combine all the information they know about that into a map so that we can do 2 things. One is so they can understand each other's viewpoints on it or the knowledge that they hold on it. Sometimes so we can compare between those different groups. So a good example would be maybe men know a different set of information from women or use different resources from women. And we can see that very clearly through the mapping. And then we can either try and share that information back to the community so that they understand each other's points of view, or else so that we can at least, in any kind of decision making that goes on, appreciate that there's different opinions and different use of resources between different people in a community. So that's one element to the participatory mapping, is so that we can make better decisions with and for the community. And then the other element, obviously, is to use that information to share that community viewpoint with officialdom, with official decision makers, policy makers, planners, anybody making decisions about the resource or about the space the community use, so that they can better understand the implications of any decisions they're going to make or any development that's going to take place, so that we hopefully come to a better outcome in terms of decision that's taken and the outcomes for the community in terms of that development process. Basically, my career's been all around this topic. So I started using participatory GIS, far too long ago now, but maybe 30 years ago, at least. So the methods and the processes that we use have kind of evolved over that period to try and take into account some of these difficulties and challenges. So I think now we're at a place where we've got a good understanding of some of these limitations, and we try and do best practice from the beginning. I think the challenges are coming in with things to do with some of the new digital approaches where we're using other tools, and then you have issues to do with who has access to that digital technology. So, for example, when we've been doing mapping of vulnerable groups' journeys across cities, when we've used digital approaches to collect that data, some of the people we most want to speak to don't have access to digital devices still, or very limited access. They're not the right kind. They're not smartphones. They haven't got a tablet computer. They might have quite an old dumb phone, basically, which means they're excluded. So there's that issue then of some of the vulnerable groups you really want to reach out to can't access that technology. So at that point, it's a case of thinking, well, is it appropriate to do this digitally from the outset? Do we want to revert back to those old school approaches that I still find really valuable, of taking paper maps into a community, working with individuals to collect their information that way, so that we can reach some of those people that otherwise won't participate and therefore won't be visible in this decision-making process. So I think those are the kind of remaining challenges, particularly in low-income settlements and communities, both in Africa, but you could apply this equally well to the UK or other parts of the world as well. For about the past 6 or 8 years, we've been experimenting with using much more creative engagement methods to widen inclusion in planning and decision making. So alongside the mapping, We then tried a lot of arts-based methods, particularly in African contexts and with low-income communities, where often they're excluded from decision-making processes. And this is a way of getting them to be able to participate in a much more engaging and widely appropriate way, if you like. So, what are creative methods? So we've done a mixture of things. We've collected digital stories where we kind of record videos like this, but with particular stakeholders, particular people, talking about their day-to-day lives and the challenges they face around a particular topic. So that could be about the kind of journeys they're making, but it could be about their experience of air pollution. We edit those with the participant into really short films that are really useful at communicating that to decision makers, so that they get a first-hand experience, if you like, of the lived experience. We've also done creative engagement. Say, one of the best examples, I think, was taking a 3D model built out of cardboard of the street that we were going to try and improve in terms of road safety and mobility, taking it out to the street where it was actually going to take place, and then allowing participants to come and engage with the model, tell us what they would like to see change, where they'd like it, and record all those suggestions. And in one day, in a street in Nairobi, we had 900 plus people come and talk to us about how they'd like that street changed. And the model was a really effective way of bringing people in because they were intrigued and excited by it. And then because it was a physical thing, they could move about and change things. Again, it was a really great way of getting their inclusion. But we've also done other kinds of arts-based things, like having poster displays and artwork created that we can take back to the community, or else record people's understanding using artists to record murals, if you like, about the kinds of changes people would like to see made. So we tested a whole range of arts-based creative methods, always in collaboration with local artists and performers. So not us personally doing it, but working in collaboration. So the artists bring their skills and their knowledge of their tools and techniques, and we work with them on the process and the kind of questions we want answered, and then we work up the most appropriate way of engaging on that. So we've used this in a number of projects now across East Africa in particular, largely again looking at cities. I think the big advantage of Participatory GIS, as I said, it can do visualization, so you can re-visualize what people have told you on a paper map or even digitally to make it more understandable for other people. But I don't think that's the most exciting part. I think the more exciting and interesting part is when you start to combine people's knowledge of their environment with official data to enhance the community understanding, but also enhance the official viewpoint on a particular topic. So, for example, we've done projects recently looking at road safety issues in Nairobi, Mombasa. We collected information from the community about where they found issues with road safety in and around low-income settlements. And then in the GIS, I was able to combine that with the official data from the Kenyan police on where road traffic accidents occurred. So what that allowed us to do was look at where there was agreement between where the community thought the risks were, which showed there was quite good agreement about the most dangerous sections based on the road traffic deaths and communities' understanding of risks. But what it also highlighted were there a number of other locations, particularly in the low-income settlements we were working in, where there were lots of road traffic risks that weren't leading to casualties, but were still important from the community's mobility point of view. And doing that in the map allowed us to do that analysis, but also then visualise where these misunderstood or missing bits of information were that the police didn't really know about, planners didn't really understand properly, so that we could improve that shared understanding and maybe hopefully lead to better outcomes in terms of road safety improvement. So my background is in geography and geographic information systems and originally remote sensing. And there was a need for those skills in the Stockholm Environment Institute in relation to the work they did on air pollution, particularly at that point in Asia. And so that's how I came into the Institute. I was recruited to do that role of map making looking at air pollution. And then quite soon after I'd started in the Institute, an opportunity came up to look at natural resource management problems in South Africa. And this is going to age me, but this was just during a transition from apartheid era. So I had the opportunity to go down to South Africa just prior to the apartheid regime collapsing or being voted out, and the return of proper democracy to South Africa. And we were working on a CEDA, Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency project, looking at natural resource management issues in some of the former homeland states as they were, so the segregated areas of South Africa. And I could apply my GIS skills in that project. So in one of the states, the one that was nearest a place called Grahamstown on the southern coast, there was lots of existing official data collected. So that meant I could use the official information that was held, digitise some of it at that point, but analyse that in a more conventional kind of GIS way. When we moved up to a place called Namaqualand, which is up near the Namibian border, that area, because it hadn't been seen as agriculturally productive or interesting by the apartheid regime, there was very sparse official data collected. So what that led to was colleagues that I was collaborating with used participatory mapping approaches in their work. So that meant they were collecting paper maps of the local community's knowledge of natural resource management. But they were just collecting them as paper maps, and then they were using them in discussions with the community, rolling them up and putting them aside. Whereas for me, I realised this was a really valuable resource. And so using the GIS, I was able to digitise those maps and then do additional things with them. So what that meant was one of the issues the community had was with water quality. They knew which water points they were collecting domestic water from, where they were watering livestock. But what they didn't know was the quality of the water in those wells. Whereas there was official data from boreholes samples that told us about dissolved aluminium that was a pollutant that could affect human health. And I was able in the GIS to combine these two bits of information together. So that allowed us to tell the community where the least polluted areas were for collecting water for their own consumption, and the wells that probably were safe for livestock because they had higher pollution levels. So that was my first kind of development of participatory GIS, was this realisation we could collect information from the community, do things with it using my skills, and add value to everything and hopefully improve people's sustainability and livelihoods. So that was my first use of GIS and participatory GIS in that kind of development work. And then the funding switched to doing UK focused work at that point, and I brought some of those techniques back to the UK. And we did a project in York looking at people's communities' knowledge of air pollution. So we asked people in York and Bristol and Sheffield to map their perceptions of where air pollution issues were. And we used the same participatory GIS approaches. People drew on maps showing where air quality was bad, where they thought it was slightly better, and we even asked them about where they thought the pollution was coming from, and also how it was affecting their health. So I could then, again, digitise those maps. We could compare different communities' knowledge, and the other thing we did was work with the city councils in those areas to compare that local community perception of air pollution with the official modelling of air pollution that was taking place at the time. And that allowed us to do a number of things. One was see where there were discrepancies between communities' understanding and the models, which either meant one of two things. It could mean the community misunderstood air pollution. They didn't really understand whether it was being generated and how it might be affecting them, because a lot of the pollutants are invisible in lots of ways. You can't see nitrogen dioxide. So there could be that issue of communities didn't understand the issue effectively. Or it could be that the way the council was collecting data on air pollution and modelling the data was missing valuable or important places where pollution was happening. So the maps allowed us to do those two things. It allowed us to help inform the community more effectively as to where the pollution problems were based on the council's knowledge, But it also critically and crucially meant the councils in some cases went back and re-measured air pollution in other parts of the city that they hadn't considered. And in some cases, particularly in York, that meant they actually identified some additional pollution hotspots that prior to the community mapping and the participatory GIS, they hadn't realised had got air pollution issues. And ultimately that led to a bigger air pollution management area for the City of York than had originally been described. So that was me bringing participatory mapping back to the UK. I then used it in a number of projects, some looking at human health issues. Then I moved on to doing city development issues, trying to bring more inclusion to city planning, which we ran in a number of different cities again, and led to, again, some really interesting results. And then the opportunity came to take some of these approaches back to Africa. So I did a number of projects looking at rural developments again, both in East Africa, Southern Africa and West Africa, particularly looking at smallholder farmers and their use of water and how we might be able to improve that. And then the opportunity came to transition more to looking at cities again and city development, again in Africa. So a lot of my research over the past decade, I guess, has been concentrating more on cities than rural areas. And we've been trying to look at how cities affect particularly vulnerable groups' health and well-being. And we've used a whole range of techniques in that. So the participatory mapping, that's my kind of bread and butter, but increasingly I've collaborated with people like physiologists and psychologists to look at measurements of well-being for particular people, both their subjective well-being, so what they tell you about how they're feeling, but increasingly we've also been combining that with sensors that can measure the physiological impacts of being in the city on different people. So we did a project in the UK initially that was looking at using brainwaves actually to measure people's reaction responses to different types of spaces in Edinburgh. And I did some of the mapping work on that in collaboration with a physiologist or a neuroscientist even. And then we've taken some of those approaches back to African contexts. So we've been doing some of these kinds of experiments for the first time in rapidly changing cities in Africa, particularly in Kenya, and trying to understand how those spaces affect different kinds of people. And the value of doing that is a lot of African cities are changing and growing very rapidly at the present time with population influxes of migration and just general population growth. But that means the cities are having to change and adapt very rapidly. And what we've been trying to do is understand how city spaces are affecting different groups so that we can try and value particular places that provide health and well-being benefits, and that those kinds of spaces are retained in African cities, rather than some of what happens in, say, European contexts, where, say, we suddenly start to realise that green spaces are really valuable and green infrastructure is really valuable for people's health and well-being. But in lots of places, we've lost it. So we're trying to reintroduce it back into our cities. In lots of African cities, there are still lots of existing pockets of green space, which haven't been valued because they're seen as development sites for building. But what we're saying is some of that green infrastructure and existing green infrastructure is really important for people's health, linked to biodiversity benefits as well, and also climate mitigation benefits. But we should be trying to retain those sorts of spaces in African cities because it brings all these benefits. So we've been doing those kinds of experiments and approaches, and also looking at just the overall environmental quality of those cities in terms of air pollution and noise, and how all those different things interact with people's health and well-being. So lots of that's involved mapping, but also, as I said, these kinds of novel measurements and approaches that we've been doing. So the sort of overarching theme in my career has been, I think, the two skills I've got. One is making maths, quite good at that. Two, I enjoy talking to people and finding things out from them. So my participatory GIS approaches and a lot of this engagement is bringing those two things together. So that's probably an overview of my career. So the advice I'd probably give myself if I was starting out again is something that actually somebody did say to me quite early in my career, which was really valuable, which is those listening skills. So what the person told me is when you're talking to somebody and you're trying to find out what they know and also learn from other people, other experts say, it's that active listening. So rather than constantly asking new questions or butting in, to let the person talk to you and absorb what they're saying and then ask a relevant question based on what they've said. So learning that skill has been really valuable for me in terms of speaking to communities and engaging with them appropriately so you can really listen to the issues they're talking about. But also flip side, when you're talking to planners and decision makers, to again listen really carefully to what they're saying so that you can understand the challenges they face, but also how they're interpreting what you're telling you. So, or what you're telling them even, so that you can try and tweak the way you're providing the message so that it's having the impact that you want it to have. So you're having the desired outcome that you want to get. So I wouldn't necessarily change what I've done. I've had a really enjoyable career, but I think learning that quite early on was quite pivotal in terms of what I've been able to do. So I think the future of participatory GIS is really strong at the moment in terms of there's this big shift towards digital mapping. We've all gone through it in Europe and North America. We've access to Google Maps and being able to record your own data onto maps quite easily now. And there's lots of online tools and platforms that enable us to do that. As I said, there's still, for me, these big challenges of the digitally excluded and how they participate in that. But I think this sort of democratization, if you like, of map making and making maps is kind of what my career's been about. And we seem to be in a sort of, I won't call it a golden age, but there's lots of new approaches emerging that enable us to do those approaches really effectively now, more broadly. So I think what that means is we can get a much greater number of people involved in these applications and these decision-making processes using some of these online tools, so that hopefully that can improve the decision outcomes and get a much broader consensus on what we want to happen, where we want it to happen, and maybe what we don't want to happen. So thank you very much for listening. Hopefully some of it's been interesting. Hopefully you can find out more on my web pages.